Good morning, Skidmore Christian Church family. Pastor Jack here, and as we come to 2 Samuel chapter 15, we're kind of in a space where, last week in chapter 14 we talked about the fact that David was longing for Absalom. Absalom had been gone for 2 years, and David missed him, and Joab could tell he just wasn't quite right, and so Joab basically sent this widow to David as a ruse to basically try to create a circumstance where David would bring Absalom back. So he does. David comes and basically he brings Absalom back, but sends him to his own house and wouldn't see him for 2 years, and then finally Absalom's sick of it and goes, why didn't I stay where I was in Gersha? It would have been better for me to stay there than come back to Jerusalem and not be restored to the king. And so he sent for Joab twice, and Joab wouldn't come. He basically burned Joab's barley field, and then that got his attention, and finally he was restored to the king. But it turns out that Absalom had his own designs on power and control. Let's pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 15. It says this. It says, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot, horses, and 50 men to run before him, and he would get up early and stand beside the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone had a grievance to bring before the king for settlement, Absalom would call out to him and say, what city are you from? And he replied, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. Absalom said to him, look, your claims are good and right, but the king does not have anyone to listen to you. He added, if only someone would appoint me judge in the land, then anyone who had a grievance or a dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he received justice. And when a person approached to pay homage to him, Absalom reached out to him and took him by the hand and took hold of him and kissed him. Absalom did this to all of the Israelites who came to the king for settlement. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So it's kind of a fascinating circumstance. Absalom's in a place where he basically is trying to usurp the king, and so one of the primary responsibilities of the king was when people had disputes, they would come to the king and they would seek justice, and they would get the finding of the king. He was standing in judgment in Israel, and Absalom basically circumvented that. He got a chariot and horses, and he got 50 men to run before him. He was basically trying to make much of himself, and he was basically trying to kind of paint himself in the picture of being king. And it was fascinating because at this point, Absalom basically sets up shop at the gate of the palace, and when people are going up to basically seek the king, and it's very obvious who are there and who has a right to be there and who's going up because they're trying to find justice, Absalom would call out to them, and when they would respond to him, he would take them and hug them, and he would basically butter them up. Everything you say is right. I see it your way. And man, if someone would just appoint me, to be, in charge, I would give everybody justice. And so he usurped the king, and he won the hearts of the men of Israel. Continuing on, it says, when 4 years had passed, Absalom said to the king, please let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. For your servant made a vow when he lived in Gersha of Aram, saying that if the Lord brings him back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. Go in peace, the king said to him, and he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent agents throughout the tribes of Israel with this message. When you hear the sound of the ram's horn, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron. 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom, and they had been invited and were going innocently, for they did not know the whole situation. And while he was offering sacrifice, Absalom sent for David's advisor Ahithophel, the Gileonite from the city of Giloy. So the conspiracy grew strong, and the people supporting Absalom continued to increase. And so this is fascinating. Basically, when Absalom is the ploy with David is Absalom says, when I was in exile, I promised that if I was ever restored to Jerusalem, that I would go and worship the Lord in Hebron. And so it's kind of fascinating at this point. David just innocently goes, you have a vow to the Lord? Go fulfill your vow. Go with my blessing. And it's fascinating because the ruse was Absalom sent men out to the tribes of Israel and says, when you hear the ram horn blow, proclaim that Absalom is king in Hebron. And even as he went up to Hebron, he brought 200 men that were from Israel or Jerusalem with him. They had no idea what's going on, but basically they get caught up in this ruse that they blow the ram's horn and they proclaim that Absalom is king in Hebron. And so continuing on to verse 13. Then an informer came to David and reported, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. David said to the servants with him in Jerusalem, get up, we have to flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Lead quickly, and he will overtake us quickly, heap disaster on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servants said to the king, whatever my lord the king decides, we are your servants. Then the king sets out, and his entire household followed him. But he left behind 10 concubines to take care of the palace. He took the king out. So the king set out, and all of the people followed him. And they stopped at the last house. And while all of the servants marched out past him, then all of the Cherethites and the Pelethites and the people of Gath, 600 men who came with him from there, marched past the king. So this is fascinating. David basically is in a circumstance where Absalom has basically carried out a coup. Absalom has won the heart of the people. He pursued the people. He got them to acknowledge that he was king. And when word finally gets back to David, but from somebody who's faithful to him, and he gets word that Absalom has done this, like, David doesn't mount up for war. He doesn't set up for war. This is a circumstance that revealed everyone's heart. You're either for David or you're for Absalom. And the king recognizes, because of all that's taken place, like, he's got to flee, and he's got to take those that are with him from there. And it's kind of a fascinating thing. You would think that he would want to hunker down and protect the palace, but he recognized that what was transpiring, if Absalom could sway the army, they would come and basically put Jerusalem to the sword. And so the king takes those that belong to him and flees, and he leaves 10 concubines to take care of the palace. And one of the things we have to keep in mind, the Lord had at one point had told David not to multiply wives to himself, but it was the custom of the kings of the region to basically not only take multiple wives, but also a harem, additional concubines. And so these were all of David's concubines, but he leaves 10 behind to take care of the palace. They're on the run, and it's heart-rending because as it continues on, they're marching out, and they're all marching past the king, and you could just see David's face just going, what has happened? Like, why has the Lord allowed this hardship and trouble to fall upon me? Continuing in verse 19, says the king said to Attai of Gath, why are you going with us? Go back and stay with the new king, since you're both a foreigner and an exile from your homeland. Besides, you only arrived yesterday. Should I make you wander around with us today while I go wherever I can? Go back and take your brothers with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness. But in response, Attai vowed to the king, as the Lord lives and my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king is, whether it means life or death, your servant will be there. Verse 22, march on, David replied to Attai, and Attai of Gath marched past with all of his men and dependents who were with him. And everyone in the countryside was weeping loudly with all of the people who were marching out of the city. As the king was crossing the Kidron Valley, all of the people were marching past the road that leads to the wilderness. And so this is fascinating. Everybody that belongs to David is marching out. Even those who have allegiance to David are marching out. They're leaving the city of Jerusalem, basically conceding it. And it's fascinating. At this point, there was this man that was newly there, Attai, who not only did he have dependents, but he had men that were fighting men that were with him. And David basically sees him as he's coming by. He calls him out, and he basically goes, why are you leaving? He's like, we're having to flee for our lives. He's like, you're new to the area. It's like, you're from another nation. You can go and basically serve the new king and live amongst the new king. You don't have to go through this difficulty and hardship. And it's kind of this beautiful picture. This man named Attai basically goes, look, everything I have and everything everyone that belongs to me serves the king, and wherever the king, if the king is alive, as the Lord lives, and as the king lives, I'll serve the Lord whether it's in life or death. And so this man, proclaims his loyalty to David, and by the way, even in the midst of all of this, even outsiders like this man are looking at what's taking place and looking at what Absalom's doing, and he basically sees the injustice. It's not proper and right for the son of the king to overthrow the king while the king still lives. And so they all continue out through the Kidron Valley and into the wilderness. It goes on to say Zadok was there, and all of the Levites were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. And they set the ark down, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until the people had finished marching past. Then the king instructed Zadok, return the ark of the Lord to the city. If I find favor with the Lord, he will bring me back and allow me to see both it and its dwelling place. However, if he should say, I do not delight in you, then here I am. He can do whatever he pleases with him. Verse 27, the king also said to the priest Zadok, look, return to the city in peace and with your two sons, your son Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan. Remember, I'll wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar returned the ark of God to Jerusalem and stayed there. So initially when they departed, they took the ark of God. And by the way, this was an incredible blessing from the Lord. Wherever the ark went, victory for Israel went. And so as they're fleeing, initially they take the ark with. And as David realizes that the priests and the ark are present, he basically goes, look, just go back to its dwelling place in Jerusalem. And he basically acknowledged, he goes, I'm in the Lord's hand. If it's God's will that I return to Jerusalem, then God will bless me and I'll see the ark and I'll see its dwelling place. But if it's not God's will, if God's blessing is not upon me, then I would rather have the ark be safe in Jerusalem. And so he basically commands the priests and his sons basically to return with the ark back to Jerusalem and to just see what's going on, and basically says, if you hear anything, send word to me. So David has some people that are have allegiance to him that are still going to be in Jerusalem. Continuing verse 30. David was climbing the slope of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he ascended. His head was covered, and he was walking barefoot, and all of the people with him were covered their heads and went up weeping as they ascended. Then someone reported to David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Lord, David pleaded, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. When David came to the summit where he used to worship God, Hushai, the Archite, was there to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, if you go away with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and tell Absalom, I will be your servant, your majesty. Previously I was your father's servant, but now I will be your servant. Then you can counteract Ahithophel's counsel for me. And won't the priests of Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Report anything you hear from the palace to the priests of Zadok and Abiathar. Take note, their two sons are there with them, Zadok's son Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan. Send them to tell me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's personal advisor, entered Jerusalem just as Absalom was entering the city. And so, basically David at this point sends a secret agent in. This gentleman who basically meets him on the top of the Mount of Olives. Hushai basically comes to David. He had been an advisor to David, loyal to David, and he comes and he basically comes with his robe torn and dust on his head. He's been mourning for what God is allowing to happen to David and those that belong to David. And it's fascinating because David, he wants to go with David, and David goes, look, go back and submit, tell Absalom that you're going to serve him because you serve me, you're going to serve him. And just know that Absalom would have been very susceptible to this. Like he wants David and those who belong to David and serve David to basically acknowledge him as king, and he thought it gave him him credence, or gave him authority, that if David's servants turned to him and served him as king, that it would show that he was just what he was doing, and what he was doing was right. And so all of that to say is, David goes, look, go and say you're going to serve Absalom, but the thing you have to understand, what I want from you is, when you hear things from Absalom and from the palace, like, report it to the priest, and the priest's sons will report it to me, so I can know what's going on. And so all of that to say is, even in the midst of David having to flee for his life, and even with the challenges and burdens of those who belong to him, and having to care for this great multitude of people, David basically was given blessing from God. There was grace from God, that he had people that were so loyal to him that would report all that was going on. And so, that being said, David is in this point of fleeing, and he's having to rely upon God. And so we talked last Sunday about the fact that when hardship and difficulty comes to us, when even persecution comes to us, like, it drives us to relationship with God. And David was king, and it's fascinating. He was in a position where no one could speak against him, no one could come against him, and then all of a sudden Absalom rises up against him, and then David is firmly in the hands of God. He's having to trust in God and rely upon him, and that's a good place to be. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for David and his life, even in the midst of him having to run for his life from Absalom. Lord, I just pray that you would just help us to see that regardless of circumstance, you are with us, and that you will sustain us. You are your right hand is mighty, and you fight for us. And Lord, I just pray that we would just trust in you like David trusted in you, and that we would just pursue what you want for our lives in a way that brings glory and honor to your kingdom. In your name we pray. Amen. Lord bless you guys. Have a great week.